Thank you very much, and it was a privilege to listen to Miles' presentation before speaking, and also it does a lot of groundwork for what I want to say, that you've heard what Miles has to say, because much of what I'm saying is underpinned by the stuff that he presented in such a scholarly fashion. As well as these declarations of interest that I'm showing you here, it occurred to me as I was listening to Miles that one of the things that I've experienced that equips me to be able to talk about men and boys is that I grew up in a pub. And you probably learn more psychiatry in the front bar of a hotel than you do in medical school. These are the three things that I want to cover today, so I'll get on with doing that, really. So there was one other thing that I wanted to say that was set off by Miles' presentation, and hopefully we'll have a chance to take this up more in the discussion. I was thinking, as he was talking about the strength of attachment theory and its acceptance as underpinning a lot of the work that we do in psychotherapy and more broadly. But I think sometimes the brand of attachment theory that we're marketed is a bit problematic, because it's it seems to be based on the idea that attachment theory is about forming nice relationships with other people, playing nicely together. And in fact, attachment theory comes out of the jungle. It's about how parents protect and keep their children safe under adversity. And so one of the things I think that about the version of attachment theory that's peddled is that it's a bit sanitised. And the other danger of attachment theory is that it's desexualised as well. And while it's understandable that people reacted against the kind of gross emphasis of sexuality in Freudian theory, there is a certain way in which by adopting the approach to attachment theory that we have, that we've inappropriately desexualised men and women, de-genderised them to a certain extent as well. The conventional wisdom at the moment is that when children behave in a problematic fashion, that they're either being naughty or they're sick. And we in the medical profession have probably emphasised the latter over the former, thinking that we're doing a good thing to protect children from the stigma of being regarded as delinquent, and instead giving them the supposedly more positive status of being sick. I think in both of these exercises of labelling, we've failed children terribly, and I think that I don't just want to restrict myself to problematic behaviour that is delinquent or aggressive, although that will be the main emphasis. I also want to think about quieter problematic behaviour in boys. So perhaps if I start with some vignettes of the kinds of things I'm talking about, just 3 or 4 boys. One, a boy who's very bright but has a receptive language disorder that nobody's recognised, so that most aspects of his school life are a breeze for him until his teacher starts to give complex verbal instructions. A second boy who comes from a stable nuclear family, one of the last surviving ones, but has been subject to a refugee experience, and the family has been traumatised by the experience both of leaving their country of origin and also by the inhumane way in which they've been treated in Australia. And he remained somewhat preoccupied with the trauma that he's experienced. A third boy who's got a guts ache and who's also comes from a family where his parents constantly bicker and include him in that bickering. And the final boy, one who is going through mental experiences of which he can't make sense, intrusive thoughts and feelings and ideas that seem somewhat crazy to him, and he's not sure whether they're coming from inside his head or from somewhere else. So if we think about conceptualising those behaviours as illness, it's relatively easy to see the labels that could be attracted by those boys. The first one might be said to have ADHD because of his disruptive behaviour, secondary to his language disorder. The second one might be said to be depressed. The third one might be said to have a somatisation disorder, and the fourth one might be said to be pre-psychotic. Now, we're not going to get rid of these kind of labels overnight. There is one little subversive thing that you can do just to detoxify the labels a little bit. If you replace disorder with reaction, you can sometimes get away with that without alienating people. So if you talk about attention deficit hyperactivity reaction, then you're smuggling into the process the idea that kids might be inattentive for a reason other than the fact that they've got some kind of disease or disorder. If you talk about a psychotic reaction, then you introduce meaning into otherwise meaningless behaviour. And so instead of thinking about any of those boys as being sick, let's try and think about them as communicating something about their predicament. I'm very influenced by a British child psychiatrist, David Taylor, who writes about unexplained signs and symptoms. This is people who get physical symptoms that nobody can explain, and which he insists on calling hysteria. He says that one of the components to presenting with unexplained signs and symptoms. So examples would be chronic fatigue syndrome or a severe pain syndrome that doesn't have any good physiological explanation, or sometimes we see kids who go blind for no reason. So those kinds of presentation, he reminds us that as well as having symptoms of a disease or an illness, we can have symptoms of a predicament. And from this point of view, think about how many symptoms the average boy has in a week, particularly a growing boy. And actually there's been research done on this, and the average person has something like 30 unexplained symptoms a week. Think headaches, guts aches, diarrhoea, nausea. If you kept a diary, it probably wouldn't be good for your health, but if you kept a diary, you'd find that probably you have a range of symptoms, whether it's from being stiff and sore after you've been for a run or whatever. Now, most of us pass over these symptoms with the fleeting thought that it might be cancer. But some people, and you can imagine the situation where your life is very restricted in some way emotionally, where you're under pressure, you can't resolve that pressure, your normal coping skills falter, and so that predicament that you're in manifests itself through physical symptoms. And sometimes, most commonly, parents will pass off those physical symptoms in a relatively benign way. But in two situations that can become problematic. One, when the parent panics about the symptoms, my God, it must be cancer, we better get you to the hospital straight away. Or the second situation, where the parent is overly dismissive of the symptoms and says, "You're having a lend of me, stop faking it, pull yourself together," and responds in a hostile fashion to it. And in both of those situations, we could imagine that kid being pressured towards pushing those symptoms forward. And then, this is where we come in as a medical profession, and we can really screw things up. We come in and we make a diagnosis. Or, more commonly, we don't make a diagnosis, but we get anxious about all kinds of possibilities. Or, we say, these parents are anxious, so just to reassure them, we'll do a few tests. And of course, people aren't reassured by tests. If they're prone to health anxiety, they're panicked by tests. God, he must really be serious because he's sending me off for a CAT scan. And if the CAT scan comes back, well, normal, well, better have another one in a few months' time just to make sure it wasn't missed. So what we can see here is the potential evolution of this boy that I described earlier as abdominal pain into something that becomes an illness and then begins to have a treatment and an incapacitating effect on that child's life. Now, note that there's no suggestion here that the kid goes through any kind of thought process whereby he says, my way out of this is to exaggerate my guts up. These children aren't malingering. Anybody with any kind of abdominal pain, whether it's explained or unexplained, will at times use that abdominal pain to serve some purpose in their life. So anybody with any kind of illness is a malingerer from time to time. But there's no reason to expect that kids who have unexplained signs and symptoms are any more malingering than any of the rest of us. So what's happening is that young people are learning to use their, in this case, physical symptoms, but in the other examples that I've described, they can learn to use their symptoms in order to lessen their level of distress. So to come back to the boy with the language disorder, the consequence of not being able to understand what the teacher says for this boy was that he felt stupid. And feeling stupid is one of the most unpleasant experiences you can give a bright pre-adolescent boy. And so in order to deal with feeling stupid, the horrible disarousing effect of feeling stupid, he learnt, and again, not on any kind of cognitive level, but just by association, he learnt that if he played the fool and people laughed at him, he could reinterpret the arousal that he was feeling in a much more positive way. It still wasn't particularly pleasant for him, it still felt a bit uncomfortable, but now when the teacher spoke in a complex way to him and he felt over-aroused and in a horrible way, he could play the fool and then kids would laugh at him and he'd feel over-aroused in a slightly less horrible way. And by the nature of these things, this began to generalise, and so that he became the class clown. But also, here was a bright boy who wasn't paying attention in class and was jumping around all over the place. So he got a diagnosis of ADHD. But if we think about this in terms of coping with his over-arousal, you can see that he doesn't actually have any problems with attending. He can attend, but he's using different strategies that override his capacity to attend. Because if we think about attention, let me just talk about attention for a moment. People will say to me, this boy's got no problems with his attention because he can sit in front of a PlayStation for 2 hours uninterrupted. That kind of attention is very low grade. Doesn't require very strong attentional skills to sit in front of a computer for a long period of time, because the computer games are designed to capture our attention. What does require a higher